want to go to my next guest. He is new to this channel, and so I greatly appreciate him for joining me. And I want to make sure I get your last name right. David, who did,
Hundeyin.
one more time.
Hundeyin.
Hundeyin, thank you.
Yeah.
I am a butcher of names. That's what I'm going to ask, as opposed to just kind of running with it. How you doing, man? Thank you for this. Thank you for joining me. And just so the audience would know, David is an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker. He's founder of West Africa Weekly and 2023 James Curie Fellow at Cambridge University. What is that? You got to tell us what that one is.
All right. So the James Curry Fellowship is a literary fellowship at the University of Cambridge, which is it's named after James Curry, who was the co-founder of the African Writers series. So if you've ever read anything from authors like Chinua Achebe or
Yes,
Bessie
when
Head,
things fall
yeah.
apart.
So
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So James Curry was the co.
Come back, come back, come back, come back, come back, come back. Oh, come back, come back, come back. Oh, he'll be back. He'll be back. He's frozen right now.
Oh, there you
I
are.
believe. There you are. Yeah, you're frozen. It's okay. Um, so you're saying they are. We got most
Oh,
of it.
right. So yeah, I was saying that the literary fellowship at Cambridge is named the African Literary Fellowship is named after James Curry. So it's basically a fellowship which once a year takes in an African author of some some reputation who the based on the what's the word the criteria determined by the department of the faculty of English at the University of Cambridge.
Yeah.
um, they decided, okay, this guy is interesting. So I applied in 2022, and I was fortunate to be accepted in 2023.
Very cool. Oh, that's very cool, man. Very cool. So I brought you on, um, because I guess there are multiple parts of Africa that I want to discuss.
Yeah.
And I got to be honest, it doesn't really get enough coverage, even on this channel. I think I have maybe one, maybe two African analysts. Um, it's a big continent, and that continent is going to be playing a much larger role in geopolitical politics, especially in the Sahel region.
Hmm.
Um, and so, thank you for joining me. It's to have conversations on this. I know Sudan is not in the Sahel. I want to put that out there in front, right? But one of my audience members, Jonay, she has been asking for a conversation about what is taking place in South Sudan, at least for weeks. And I told her the first time I get the opportunity to have somebody to discuss it, I will do so. And so let's step into this. Could you, what is happening? I mean, my understanding there was a civil war
Yeah.
in South Sudan. Why is there a civil war in South Sudan? How did it take place? Give us, I guess, a background summary just for us to step into the topic.
So the publicly available narrative is that there was a schism between what is now North Sudan and South Sudan. Essentially, that the North Sudanese, or the Sudanese, which obviously identify as Arab, even though they look, again, there's something very interesting going on there, because if we look at them, they're clearly phenotypically African, but they self-identify as Arab. Um, and in situations like that, as often tends to be the case, you basically have a civil war, which is basically what was happening, because you have the South Sudanese who did not identify as Arab, and especially did not identify as Muslim. So they were Christian, they were African traditional religionists primarily, and the government, the former Sudanese government of a guy called Omar al Bashir, for whatever reason, had this idea that um, for the sake of national cohesion of Sudan or whatever it was, that any identity apart from Arab Muslim had to be extinguished, right? So this guy, he created this thing which he's now historically known as the Janjaweed militia. So basically, what they were is they were a non-state group whose primary remit was essentially to commit genocide. They were a non-state group, but they operated under sort of a nudge wink agreement with the Sudanese state. This is all documented, by the way, and this went
No,
on
I don't
for.
disagree with you. It's just that is astonishing. I mean, you have two. If you're in Egypt, for example, you have
Mm,
Nubians and you have Arabs,
mm,
and they just kind of coexist. And it's like, hey, you're Nubian, you're like me, or these other
mm.
people aren't. If one turns around and says, hey, let's kill everybody else, that's pretty out there. But please, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's
Yeah,
just
so again, which is why I said it's the accepted narrative, because for those who are not familiar with the sheer amount of foreign interference and meddling that goes on in Africa, and who just hear of these African conflicts, it's very easy to get the idea that, oh, well, this is just what Africans are. Africans just wake up
right.
one morning and just randomly start killing each other. So, according to the public narrative, that's what it was. It was a bunch of Africans deciding to kill another bunch of Africans because of their religion or their assumed ethnicity or whatever, which is true on some level. But the story that is not told is that what was behind this. This, because just to be clear, the fact that Sudanese are both Christian and Muslim, are both Arab and Dinka and New or whatever, that is something that has existed for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It's not a new thing. So the reason why over the past 2 or 3 decades it became something that led to the genocide in Darfur and in South Sudan, that was externally instigated. That's a story that is almost entirely glossed over. And I think part of the reason the story is almost entirely glossed over is that it's not the type of external interference that we're sort of used to dealing with, because the type of external interference we're used to hearing about in Africa is primarily Western political interference from the US and from its European allies. In this case, this was interference from states in the Gulf. So the likes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE specifically, these states, I guess a lot of people don't realize this. These states also have their own designs on expanding their sphere of influence. Right, everyone is trying to build an empire in Africa's neighborhood, except Africans, fortunately or unfortunately. So as I caught a, a bit of a last conversation you had with the previous guest, where he mentioned that the Turkish government has this idea of sort of reviving the old
Ottoman
Ottoman
Empire.
Empire.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Europeans obviously have their own, different European countries have their own empires carved out historically, which are now shrinking. The US obviously has the entire world, or intends to have the entire world as its stomping ground. The Russians are building, they have their own obvious sphere of influence as well. And so do the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They have exactly the same thing. It's just not as publicly recognized, so it flies under the radar a lot. And Sudan, unfortunately, happens to be the key flashpoint on the African continent where these guys feel like this is where their influence can be brought to bear, the UAE specifically. Because the story of what led to the division of Sudan and South Sudan kind of flows into the story of what is still happening in both Sudan and South Sudan, even today as we speak. Part of the reason that is that this Janjaweed militia that I referenced earlier, which was sort of raised as a non-state militia to go around murdering Africans who didn't identify as Muslims.
Come on. This is interesting. I'm learning something. Come on.
Why does
Here
that
we
keep
go.
happening? Okay. Oh,
Oh, there you are. Okay.
yeah. So
Please continue. You're fine. No, you're perfectly fine. Oh, come
we've
on.
gone off again.
No,
Morphed
you're
into
fine.
what morphed into what we now know as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. Because basically what happened was, after the end of the Darfur genocide, it didn't really end, but for the sake of convention, we all like to pretend that it did. And after the division of North Sudan and South Sudan, the Janjaweed militia didn't really have a purpose anymore. So the Sudanese government then, the military government then, repurposed this Janjaweed militia into something called the Rapid Support Forces, which was supposed to act as a sort of co-military, if that makes sense. And the
Yeah, that's
primary
not.
reason for doing this, the primary reason for doing this was not because they thought it made sense or they wanted it to be the case, but it was that these are battle-hardened people who have been fighting for years, some decades. They're well armed, they're well resourced. So what are you going to do with them when they no longer have something to fight for?
Why
Right.
not
So you
press them
can't
into the
just,
military?
yeah, that was the idea. But the thing is, these people have operated outside of conventional military command for so long. They have their own command structure. They have their own economic
I
structure as
see.
well. Because something else, which I guess isn't also widely talked about, is that a lot of the funding that kept this organization alive also came from things like illegal mining, gold mining in Sudan, because Sudan obviously is a large producer of gold. So the nexus, I'm sure you're aware of the nexus between Dubai, which is in the UAE, and the global illegal gold trade.
Yes.
Dubai is like the HQ of illegal gold trafficking, basically. So these guys had basically figured out an entire parallel funding structure to keep the organizations going. So, as the Sudanese government, you can't just tell them, okay, you're done, everybody go home, because that will lead to a civil war, because they can exist without you, and they have their arms, they have everything they need to exist and to fight. So, the idea was to create this sort of nervous balance between the Sudanese armed forces and this so called RSF. As you can imagine, that didn't last very long because the RSF kept trying to assert itself and kept trying to become more powerful. And the Sudanese armed forces eventually said, "Look, you're done,
No.
right? We're going to reintegrate you into the army." So the Sudanese armed forces they proposed a plan where within 2 years, most of the RSF will be incorporated into the Sudanese armed forces, and the RSF proposed a counter plan which was going to stretch this out to 10 years. So obviously you can get the import of what was going on here. They had no intention of being integrated into the Sudanese military, and that was when the current civil war in Sudan broke out, which is still going on. And I think it's been very well documented how the RSF receives regular military shipments from the UAE. It's been very, very well documented. It's been on the news. It's been covered. So that's not a secret. Um, who has an interest in funding the RSF, which is the direct descendant of the Janjaweed militia? So that's for Sudan or North Sudan. Now, South Sudan, that is it's a story with many moving parts. So as a as an as an African, as a Black African, it's very easy to feel a lot of sympathy for the South Sudanese cause from my point of view because for the longest time, basically they were suffering.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
Hello?
Okay. Yeah, you're back. Okay, go ahead. Oh, come on, come on, come on. This is
Yeah, I'm
interesting.
not exactly sure why that keeps happening. I'm not sure if my Wi-Fi does this because I don't know. This seems to happen whenever I'm streaming, live
No
streaming.
worries.
It doesn't happen any other time. Very weird. Anyway, so they were suffering a genocide for decades, and in 2011, then they had the referendum, the UN aided referendum, where they split off and became an independent country. And in
Mhm.
fairness to them, um, the amount of development that they've witnessed since 2011 is probably more than at any point since Sudan became an independent country.
Wow.
So to put this into perspective, as at 2011, Juba, which was the capital of Sudan,
Yeah, he is a good guess. Restless native. He is. No, he is. Oh, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
okay,
It's queuing.
yeah.
No, what's going
So
on is queuing. It's sometimes if the Wi-Fi, sometimes if it depends on the streaming software. If you cut down the frames per something, I'm not
right,
yeah, I'm not great with
okay.
this. So it's yeah, I'm not great with this.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So I was saying that as at 2011, I think the entire country had less than 500 kilometers of paved roads at the time. So part of the genocide that had been inflicted on them, it wasn't just um, direct violence; it was also structural violence. So the government in Khartoum had made sure that as little investment as possible had gone into the parts of the country that were deemed to be undesirable, because the ultimate goal was basically to make these people disappear and then repopulate these areas with people that were considered Arab or Berber.
Basically, Arabs, Muslims, etc.
They really
No,
had
it's
nothing.
okay. Don't get frustrated. You're fine. You're fine. It happens. It happens. Go for it.
So at the point they gained independence, they really had nothing. But what they did have going for them was that South Sudan, as you know, is oil rich. So they had an opportunity to actually build infrastructure and build a government, build a country, which to a certain extent they have done to a certain extent, because if you compare Juba now to Juba in 2011, it's absolute night and day. I mean, they now have four-star hotels and
Mhm.
expressways and things that just didn't exist a decade and a half ago. So
Wow.
they, they have done reasonably well for themselves. Now, where the complication comes in is that it would be a mistake to then think that this is a simple story of a group of people who bravely fought for freedom from oppression and fought for their independence, and they're now making their brave way in the world. That's a very romantic way of looking at it from the point of view of an African. Unfortunately, that's also completely inaccurate, because the part of the story that isn't told is that the US government played a central role in making that referendum possible. And the reason it did that wasn't because
Oh, this is going to get interesting. Let's get into Wesley Clark. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
right.
No, go ahead. Keep going. You said the U.S. played a central role in making sure that referendum took place.
Okay, I'm just gonna switch the Wi-Fi altogether.
Now, what was up? He's switching. He's flipping Wi-Fi. Okay. Maybe just audio will work. Okay.
Yeah, I've switched
Okay.
my Wi-Fi connection. I've switched the Wi-Fi connection, so let's hope this one holds up.
Okay.
It
So
doesn't
you said the
doesn't
U.S.
again.
The reason that this took place was because the U.S. got involved and made sure that referendum took place, basically splitting
Yeah,
off South Sudan from Sudan.
yeah. So the geopolitical calculation that the U.S. government was making was something which was completely unknown to most of us at the time, because I witnessed these events like in real time, even though I wasn't there, but I was following
Mhm.
these things fairly closely at the time, and I had no idea of things that were happening in the background, because apparently what was happening in the background was that in Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, Kenya is like next door to South Sudan.
Right.
A bunch of U.S. diplomats had basically set up shop there for years with the
Yes.
goal of negotiating the breakup of Sudan into North Sudan and South Sudan.
Please let me interrupt you on that one. Wesley
Yeah.
Clark. So Wesley Clark here in the U.S. made this point back
Mm.
in 2020 that the U.S. objective was to effectively topple all of these governments in the Middle East. Sudan was one of those
I'm getting
governments.
there. I'm
Yeah.
getting there.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So the goal was not to um, protect South Sudanese people by giving them an independent republic. The goal was to break up Sudan. So, in the process of breaking up Sudan, I guess a byproduct of that was that the South Sudanese people then got their own homeland, which I guess they're kind of happy about. But the main objective primarily was the breakup of Sudan. And the reason Sudan needed to be broken up, as was very eloquently spoken about recently by you mentioned Wesley Clark. Other prominent U.S. commentators have spoken about this recently. There was I forget his name now.
Jeffrey
He's
Sachs.
a well-known economics professor. I forget his
Jeffrey
name.
Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs.
Yes, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs. Yes, he spoke about that fairly recently as well. The goal was essentially every country in the Middle East and North Africa whose geopolitical position on Israel was hostile, that country needed to be taken out. So, and the definition of taken out means different things in different places. So, in Iraq, it meant that the 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 Ba'ath Party and the regime of Saddam Hussein needed to be, consigned to history. In Syria, it meant the same thing. But in Sudan, it meant that in addition to just regime change, the country itself, just by its existence, was deemed to be a threat to Israel. So the country needed to be split up. So if you look at it's very interesting the way it was split up. It was split up in such a way that all of the oil resources, which are basically which were the country's primary source of government revenue at the time, all of the oil resources, which were located in the southern part of the country, where the demarcation was done in such a careful manner that they all fell within South Sudan. So essentially, North Sudan was stripped of all its financial capacity to present any kind of a problem to Benjamin
Mm.
Netanyahu. So South Sudan then sort of, you know, saw itself, aflush with these like newfound riches. You know, if one wasn't familiar with the geopolitics behind all of this, it would have been very easy to think of this as some sort of romantic story. It wasn't, right? And these riches didn't come without strings attached. One of the strings attached is some of the things we've been seeing over the past few weeks, where um, Donald Trump's most outrageous, outlandish ideas that no one else has been willing to accept always seem to find an audience in South Sudan. So, for example, the decision to start deporting people to third countries. That's these countries are not the countries that they come from, and it's not the country they're being deported from. So it's a third country that has absolutely nothing to do with this person. And these are some of the very worst people in the world. So you have child molesters, you have rapists, you have people who rape people living with mental disabilities. You had all sorts of things, kidnappers, drug traffickers on that list. And the South Sudanese government say, hey, we'll happily take them in because the US is looking for a destination for these people. And
Wow.
the South Sudanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually put out a statement saying openly that because the US stood by them during the referendum era and the US was so useful to them during their fight for independence, so in the spirit of shared interests or whatever the hell that was, then they responded positively to this request, right? So essentially, South Sudan has taken up a role as the dustbin of the US empire, and it's a permanent role. It's a role that isn't going to stop. And the reason it's taken on that role is because, well, from its point of view, um, one good turn deserves another. So the US government helped it to gain independence from
Interesting.
Sudan. So in return, it has to do absolutely everything that the US government asks of it. We even saw recently where the proposal was mentioned. I believe this came out in the news that South Sudan was being spoken to about the possibility of taking in
Got
Palestinians
that. Yeah.
who are supposedly due to be evicted from Gaza. I mean, anyone who has any sort of basic historical awareness on this entire continent knows that that would be an absolute disaster. Under no circumstances should South Sudan or any African country allow itself to be used as the destination for people who are being expelled from their own land. It's not going to end well, not for them and not for the country in question. It just will not end well for anyone concerned. But South Sudan officially put out a disclaimer saying they are not in any such conversations. But I believe this was the Telegraph. I'm reading the story now, and it was the story came out the day after the denial, and he said that even though they put out the denial, that the source that the Telegraph has been speaking to is positive, that there are four-way talks going on about the expulsion of Gazans from Gaza, and that South Sudan is involved in those talks. So essentially, this independence that South Sudan was gifted by virtue of the US, this independence from North Sudan isn't independence at all. They basically turned into a geopolitical vassal state of the US, and not in a good way at all.
So one part of Sudan ends up in war, and the other one ends
Mhm.
up a vassal, which
Yeah,
effectively diminishes both.
exactly. So basically, that any sort of geopolitical threats that Sudan as a whole might have once presented, whether to Israel or to the US or whatever, has been completely neutralized. So half of Sudan, the upper half of Sudan, the goal for anyone who I guess has a functioning pair of eyes is to keep it enmeshed in conflict for as long as possible, never ending conflict, right? Because it's clear that there, on the one hand, you have the Sudanese armed forces and the majority of the Sudanese population. That much is clear. And on the other hand, you have this group which has zero legitimacy, which is not recognized internationally, which seems to keep getting all this funding and support and equipment, and they just keep it going. This civil war has been going on for what, 3 years now, and it
Yeah.
shows no signs of stopping. Most recently, you've been seeing the rapid support forces getting hold of drones, carrying out airstrikes. Where does it happen that a rebel force, essentially, for lack of a better term, a terrorist force, has access to an air to air support? How is that possible? So you can obviously tell that this is being heavily supported and funded by people with the geopolitical interests, not necessarily in even capturing Sudan and taking over the Sudanese state, because I think we now know that's not a realistic outcome.
Just keep it at
It's
war.
not realistically going to happen. But the goal is just to keep the war going for as long
Yeah.
as possible, keep Sudan in a state of constant and ongoing instability, in a manner similar to what has been done to Somalia as well.
Hmm.
Because I believe Somalia was also on that list of states mentioned by General Wesley Clark. So sometimes the goal is not necessarily just regime change. Sometimes the very existence of the country is the threat. And to neutralize that threat, you either basically split the country up into multiple bits, which are then enmeshed in their own sort of petty conflicts, which, no one ever asks, how is it that someone is always willing to fund these things, because war is not cheap. And nobody ever
No.
asks that question in Africa. How is the world's poorest continent or the world's poorest people? How do they always find the fantastic sums of money involved in carrying out large scale military conflicts for years or decades at a time? So it's either that, or even if the country is left, substantially intact as a corporate state, you just enmesh it in civil war to time indefinite. And that seems to be exactly what is happening in front of us.
Yeah, man. There's always some fascist, thick neck, lunatic with that's willing to do things
Yeah.
for cash. It's like, hey, you seem like a pretty undesirable fella. Let me give you some money. Are you willing to go kill people? And they say, yeah, I
Yeah.
am. Yeah, the RSF thing blew my mind because it's like it's a second military, and it's like, well, the dispensation of force. How are you going to have it in two places? It's one or the other. I mean, it's like the Prigozhin thing, right, in Russia, where you have this
Mm.
paramilitary group, and all of a sudden he's like, I want to take over Russia. Okay, okay. Man, thank you for this. The, fantastic breakdown. Fantastic breakdown. Because I have to be honest, we covered this, but we didn't cover it necessarily in depth when I was at the
Mm.
network. Um, we saw it take place. We understood that this was on the list of countries, but the mechanics of it, I didn't understand, and I didn't quite understand how these countries, how the split took place, why the split took place, how the war was going on
Mm.
between the, I guess you can say, Northern Sudanese or the Sudanese military versus the RSF, as you kept saying, or as you pointed out, how they're being funded, meaning they're having a large scale conflict with a country and yet are able to keep going with the country. It puts you in the mind of, oh, what is that country? Ethiopia, where you have like the former government, it'll come to me in a moment,
Mm.
attacks the actual Ethiopian government. And the
Mm.
US media, the way the media reports it is, the Ethiopian government is attacking the TPLF. And it's like, whoa,
Yeah.
that didn't happen. That wasn't it. That
Yeah.
wasn't it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was so warped the way they were reporting here because the TPLF, of course, was associated with had previous connections with the U.S. and
Yeah.
opposed to just kind of reporting it honestly. The former government tries
Yeah.
to overthrow the actual government of Ethiopia. They report it in a different way, and it's like, okay, where are they getting the weapons?
So
How are you fighting a full
it's
blown government?
I think you've mentioned something very important because it's emblematic of, I guess, US foreign policy toward
Yes,
Africa. If you've noticed, it seems to be the case that wherever there's a geographically big African country, so be that Ethiopia, be that Somalia, be that Nigeria, be that Sudan, even DRC to a lesser extent, you will often find a very interesting theme running through all of them, which is that for whether stated or unstated, the US the government's position seems to be that these countries in their large states should not be allowed to exist.
yes,
That in some way, shape, or form, having these countries exist as a unitary state with a powerful central government is not a desirable thing. So instead, in Ethiopia, you will often find solutions proposed, such as that which used to be the case prior to Abiy Ahmed, where you essentially have different regions of the country having their own governments, and
right,
essentially the country lacks a unified central government. So the country basically has no real geopolitical leverage. The country has no unified foreign policy. It barely has a military to speak of. It's just, it's just like a cobbled together thing, which is just sort of hanging on for dear life. Something
yeah,
similar going on in Nigeria now, where these secessionist movements, which pretty much didn't exist in any, definitely not in a violent sense. They didn't exist a decade and a half ago. All of a sudden, you then have, if you've heard of this policy think tank called the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which is one of the most
yes,
powerful think tanks in the whole of Washington. You then have the
mhm,
AEI putting out op-eds, right, putting out articles, policy proposals on its website, stating that the U.S. government should stand behind Biafran secessionists and that they are being oppressed, by the brutal Nigerian government in Abuja. Now, obviously, I'm not holding any brief whatsoever for the Nigerian government. I myself, I've had my life, almost ended by the Nigerian government. Right? They're not nice people. But the point is that the U.S. government is not trying to, has no interest in protecting the lives of the Afghans or whatever. The same way it had no interest in protecting the lives of South Sudanese. The point of this is to break up a large African country that has the potential to someday become economically and politically powerful.
yeah,
That's the goal. Similar
yeah,
thing to what is happening in the DRC, where you have these groups like M23, which this has been documented in so many different ways that these groups have international support, including US support, right? So the actual Congolese government in Kinshasa basically doesn't have the capacity to enforce its will more than 200 kilometers from Kinshasa. So basically, the majority of the country is just ungoverned territory. Right? And you
wow,
have these little fiefdoms that rule different bits of the country, and they all happen to be friendly with the US. Right? So it's not stated publicly, but the clear implication is the US would very much like the status quo to persist. Right?
power issue.
So, or, I can think of so many examples, or Somalia, where it's always the case that in some way, shape, or form, whatever the dispute is, whether it's the Somalian disputes with Somaliland, or whether it's the internal Somalian dispute, because there's never a shortage of those, there's always some sort of US funding available
Yes,
for conflict. There's always, like, that is never in doubt, right? No matter how low the HDI indices are, no matter how many people die of whatever it is they're dying of, no matter how miserable or how immiserated the country is, there's always money for war, and the money is always externally sourced. Right? So
yeah,
to me, it's clear that what the U.S. government would like for the African continent is for it to be made up of if possible, 100, 150 tiny, like micro ethnic, micro states,
Well, if
none
you
of
don't
which
want,
will have, yeah, none of which will have any power whatsoever. All of them will have like the tiny little useless non-convertible currencies, because that is already the case. You have a continent which has 54 countries, which personally I really think is too many, has 35 currency zones, right? So as you move through Africa, you move through 35 currency zones, and all of these currencies are non-convertible with each other. So if you want to do any transaction across these currency zones, you're going to have to use US dollars as the bridging currency. That's how trade is carried out within Africa. So if I'm in Nigeria right now, I don't have the capacity to trade with someone in Kenya, except I use US dollars to trade.
wow.
If I'm in Ghana, I don't have the capacity to trade with someone in Burkina Faso, which is literally next door. It's one border away from me. I have to use US dollars because we all have different, we're all in different currency zones, 35 of them. That seems to be the way that the US government would prefer for Africa to remain fractured, disjointed, disconnected from each other, unable to coalesce into something that is larger than the sum of its parts. And that's exactly where we are right now.
And the African Union, they don't bring this up, that this is, it makes no sense.
Well, so the African Union supposedly has something called the Agenda 2063, which is meant to address all of this. So the Agenda 2063 is that by 2063, Africa should have a common
Wait, if you
currency.
said 2063, you have to wait
Yeah,
30 years, 40
2060.
years?
Supposedly, that's the policy. Supposedly. Now, as crazy as that will sound to you, it gets worse because even though all these that supposedly Africa should have a what's it called, the open skies
Common currency.
agreement, so that
Oh,
so the air
okay.
travel becomes cheaper across the continent. Africa should
Mhm.
have a free trade zone. It's called the AFCFTA, which supposedly has come into effect already, but on paper, not in practice. So supposedly rail and road links across the continent, all of this good stuff, right? Now, the problem with Agenda 2063 and the problem with the AU as a whole is that something like 80% of the AU's annual funding comes from outside of Africa, and most of it, by the way, comes from the EU. So that's exactly the problem. So if Europe, which obviously, if Africa were to put these proposals into effect, Africa would become a much, 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 much larger economy than Europe and exponentially more powerful than Europe, right on Europe's southern border. So obviously, the Europeans have no incentive whatsoever to want to see these things happen. None.
Yeah.
So if the Europeans are the ones funding your premier continental institution, then it goes without saying that all of the funding mechanisms to put these policies into action, those mechanisms will never operate.
Come to
And
fruition.
I'll give you a very clear example of this. I remember back in 2012, there was a proposal that was raised, a very, what in my opinion, a very sensible and obvious proposal for something called the AU passport. So the idea was that just like how it is in North America, where if you have a US or a Canadian passport, you can move through the entire North American continent seamlessly. You don't need
Right.
a visa or anything like that, right? Or in Europe, where if you
And
have,
you're
say, if you have a German passport and you want to go to Lithuania or the UK or Sweden or whatever, you don't need a passport. I
right.
don't, you don't need a
Visa.
visa,
Hmm.
right? It's seamless movement. So the idea was create something called an AU passport, which can do something similar in Africa. Now, the idea wasn't that absolutely every Tom, Dick, and Harry should get an AU passport in Africa, because I also have to admit that might cause certain complications, especially where the institutions are not ready to deal with that sort of movement yet. But at the very least, some of the continent's most sort of economically relevant and important people. Um, so if you've heard of somebody called Aliko Dangote, he's the wealthiest man in Africa. He's a Nigerian billionaire. I think he's worth $25.6 billion, and
Much money.
he gave this famous he made this famous statement in public where he said that even at his level, that just to travel around Africa, because his business empire is built primarily around things like cement and FMCGs and things like that across Africa. But just to travel around Africa, he needs 35 visas.
Are
Whereas
you
if
serious?
yeah,
Are you serious?
yeah, yeah, with his Nigerian passport, he needs 35 visas to travel around Africa. Meanwhile, so it was a very famous speech that he gave because he was sitting next to this. It was like a business school. He was speaking to an audience, and he was speaking next to this white guy who's like the moderator, right? This white guy is not a billionaire. He's not a person of any significance. He's just a moderator, right? So he's saying, at my level, I'm the richest man in Africa. I need 35 visas to travel around my own continent. But John over here, who's just some random guy from France or wherever, John needs none. So this guy has more access to Africa than I do. And he's not a billionaire. He's just a random European guy.
Rando guy.
And and he has
Rando.
more access to Africa than a billionaire who's worth $25 billion because the billionaire happens to be Nigerian. So obviously that makes no sense. So the idea was that at the very least, people like that should have AU passports at the very least, right? Government officials, captains of industry, culturally significant people, musicians, people who need to move around a lot.
Right.
And so the deadline that was given, or the date that was given for the launch of the AU passport program, was January 1, 2014. Well, today is August 18, 2025, and I can tell you that there is still no such thing as an AE passport 11 years later, 11 and a half years later. It just didn't happen. And the simple reason that it didn't happen was that the funding mechanism to put this AU passport program into action, it never came through because the entity funding most of the AU's operations is the EU. And as far as the EU is concerned, it's not in their interest for Africa to open up to itself. It's not in their interest for Africa to become a single trading entity and for the rate of intra-African trade to grow. Currently, Africa has the world's lowest rate of intra-regional trade by far. It's just 15%. Most of Africa's trade is bilateral and it's external, right? So in the US, you have a situation where I think something like, is it 35 or 40, correct me if I'm wrong, 35 to 40% of US trade is Pan American in some way, shape, or
Right.
form. Similar things in Europe. In Africa, it's just 15%. And Africa is a much larger continent than either of North America or Europe. So there's just an incredible amount of wealth that is being that the continent is just hemorrhaging on a daily basis. Because instead of trading within itself, it's just constantly sending stuff out
That
in
is
exchange for
amazing.
US dollars.
Because look, I would tell you,
And
under normal circumstances, it's believed that like railways, the ability to trade across borders. I mean, the entire point of the European, like, well, I know some people would disagree with this, but let's say the economic point. It's an economic program. Like
mm,
we want the ability to cross borders, money to cross borders, people to cross borders, et cetera, because
yeah,
that makes it easier for you to get
yeah,
goods from point A to point B. If you're in a situation where it is for me to get something out of my country to your other country, even though we're on the same continent, I have to have this pain in the ass.
yeah,
It kills economic development.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, which is why the economic state of Africa that currently exists is not accidental. It's not because Africans, are are not hardworking or are not innovative, or
Yeah.
it's purely structural. It's entirely structural. If those fairly obvious things were to be put in place, things which are being actively obstructed by entities like the EU, if those things were to be put in place tomorrow, we wouldn't be talking about a 40-year plan like China. We'll be talking about a 5 to 10 year transformation, economic transformation of the continent. It really
Right.
wouldn't take that long. But the obstruction is a daily and ongoing thing. And the unfortunate thing is that there's this whole entire hidden infrastructure of global sort of political interference that makes it such that all of this is going on in the background, and you who lives in Africa is not even aware of it. right? So for you to know what is going on, you have to be really, really tapped in to the system. You need to really understand, because you're not going to see this in a newspaper or on TV. These are not things that are discussed openly. So the narratives that you readily see plastered in front of your eyes every day, even as an African, is that Africa lacks innovation, Africans are not forward thinking, Africans are maybe a bit dumb and lazy or whatever. That these are the narratives you get that are constantly fed to you on a daily, ongoing basis. It's like this huge, massive propaganda campaign, right? Well, you're never hearing about issues like why, for example, the AU's so-called Agenda 2063. Why isn't even a 2063 agenda? Why wasn't it a 2016 or 2020? Why do you have to wait for somebody's lifetime to be able to get what people elsewhere already have today?
It's
What
like
is the
40
big
years.
deal, for example? What is the big deal about signing an open skies agreement? I'll tell you something else you don't know. If you wanted to fly from Accra to Nairobi, that's from Ghana to Kenya, the amount of money you would pay for the cheapest possible ticket is like $800. Now, for the equivalent
What?
distance in Europe, yeah, the equivalent distance in Europe, you'd pay about $350 for that flight. So Africa is by far the most expensive place to fly in the world. And it's more expensive to fly within Africa than to fly from Africa to another continent. Like, it's actually more expensive to fly from Ghana to South Africa than it is to fly from Ghana to Dubai or from Ghana to London. That's the reality. Why is that the case? Because there are all these disparate tax jurisdictions and things within the continent. There is no open skies agreement within the continent. It doesn't cost money to sign an open skies agreement to harmonize all these tax issues so that the price of travel can come down. But all you will ever hear is that the reason that this agreement has not been signed is because African leaders are incompetent, African leaders are corrupt, African leaders are lazy and stupid, and they don't understand the issues and yada. That's what I've been hearing since I was a child. And then when you get older and you get tapped into the system, you realize that's not what's going on at all. African leaders are entirely aware of what they should and should not do, ideally. The problem is that there's a whole hidden international infrastructure of interference that ensures that they do not do the things that they're supposed to do. And then if you talk about it, then the other thing that is instantly trotted out is that, oh, you're blaming white people for your problems. You're not taking responsibility and yada yada yada, or the usual stuff. You're a conspiracy theorist, and this stuff exists. And if you're tapped into the system, like, and I don't mean like becoming the president. I mean just maybe a journalist, a researcher. You kind of like have a basic handle on what is going on. You realize very quickly that this is what is going on. So it's not as if this continent is just poor by default. This continent is being actively impoverished.
See, there's the rub. And then you take it in your own hands, like Ibrahim Traore, and they're like, oh my
Mhm.
God, it's a junta.
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
dude, you can't have
Exactly.
it both ways, right? Either
Exactly.
the system needs to be broken because it's a democracy in name only, where the democracy is trying to maintain a global order that is not in our best interest. It's a systemic issue. Or you do something that is in your own best interest as a country. You can't have it both
Yeah.
ways. Like it's no, I get it. I totally get it. I have to bring you back on because I want to delve into this stuff. Because look, you're right. It's if other countries uses terrorism in order to undermine their capability for cohesion, okay, well that's not you. That's other countries that are
Yeah.
intruding into your politics. If
Exactly.
you have, or if other countries have a vested interests that are, let's say, much larger, that have maybe a colonialist influence on the country, and things like open skies, things like the ability to have cohesion among the country. 2060 is insane. That's like 43 years, 40 years. It's like, yeah, we'll get to this in 40 years. Okay, how does that make sense? When you're looking at Europe, you're looking at North America, they did that because it was in our best interest to do that for reasons of
Yeah.
economic development, political cohesion, to prevent wars, those type of things. The entire European Union, part of it is let's not have another European war. These were bad ideas.
Exactly. Yeah.
So no, I totally get where you're coming from. That's aggravating. I totally get it. I got to bring you back on, man. Thank you for this. I really do appreciate it. David
Thank you for having me.
Hundeyin. Did I nail it? Did I get that right?
Hundeyin.
Hundeyin. Thank you. Hundeyin.
Yeah.
Hundeyin. Okay. David Hundeyin.
Close enough.
He is investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of the West Africa Weekly, and 2023 James Curry Fellows at Cambridge University. Thank you for this, man. I really do appreciate it. Great breakdown, by the way. Fantastic breakdown.
Thank you for having me.
You be safe.
Yeah.
All right. Great new guest. Oh, that's a great new guest. It's like you're just sitting there listening, like, tell me more, tell me more. Greatly appreciate him. Greatly appreciate him. That was a fantastic breakdown of Sudan, fantastic breakdown of what is taking place in Africa as a whole. He has my appreciation for that. I got to bring him back. I got to bring him